we're going on to chapter 16, so we can meet the Blessed Bab on the road to Tehran. That's what the chapter is called. Now, by this time, many people had heard the Bab's message and followed him in great crowds to hear him speak. Wherever he went, they thronged about him. Everyone who was with him loved the Bab dearly, and they would do all that they could for him. Of course, they didn't feel this way about the other leaders in the city. Most of these leaders were very proud, and some of them were very cruel to people who didn't think exactly the way they thought. And these men grew jealous of the Bab because of his popularity and because the people loved him so. So at last they determined to get rid of the Bab. Manucher Khan was the governor of that part of the country where the Bab was then teaching. I didn't really pronounce that right, you know. I'm trying to get the exact pronunciation, but it's very important too. So I've asked Dr. Amin Banani, who's helping with this project on these children's stories from the Dawnbreakers, to tell us exactly how we should pronounce the name of this man, because he's a wonderful and important man. Dr. Banani, would you pronounce that for us, please?
Manucher Khan.
Once more, if you please.
Manucher Khan.
Did you get that? You all want to try it? Try it once. Manucher Khan. That's closer. I am now a little closer than I was before, but you know why that's important? You should learn to pronounce all of the Persian names, because that's very important. That's the language of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. And when you're little, it's a lot easier than when you're an old man like me. Of course, my heart is young, but I'll tell you something else. It's not only you should pronounce Persian, you should learn to speak it. Learning when you're young, you can read the words of the Bab and Baha'u'llah in the original language. Isn't that an exciting thing for all of us to think about? All right, now, Manucher Khan, the governor of that part of the country, and he was very friendly to the Bab, and he believed in his message. He loved him. So, when the governor was told about the wicked plan of these leaders against the Bab, Manucher Khan made up his mind to save the Bab. He would pretend to send the Bab to the Shah in Tehran with soldiers, and in this way get the Bab out of the city. Everybody would see him leave. This city was Isfahan. Beautiful city, really, very lovely. Well, that's what he did. One day, about sunset, the Bab, with 500 of the governor's own bodyguard, soldiers on horseback. Isn't that a beautiful picture? You can see them leaving the gate of the city and starting toward Tehran. Well, they didn't go to Tehran, however. The governor had given orders that every few miles, part of the guard should return to the city. And at last, only 3 were left with the Bab. These were the ones whom the governor trusted most. That's why he only had 3 left. Then these 3, by a road on which they would meet very few travelers, brought the Bab back to the city, which they entered at dawn. They took the Bab to the governor's house, and here he lived quietly for quite a time. Only a few close friends knew where he was. You know, those were some of the happiest days of the Bab's life, the days that he spent in Isfahan. There were some sad days too, but in all it was a very nice time. And I stood in the place where the governor's house once stood when I was there, so I'm going to cheat just a little here and tell you something about Manucher Khan, just a little bit, because he was such a wonderful man, you know. One night, in his house, in the garden outside of his house, the governor told the Bab, "God has given me great riches. Now that I know that you're the promised one, I desire that all of my possessions go to the furthering of the interests of this faith." Isn't that wonderful? And Manucher Khan said that he would go to the capital himself. He would convert the king, bring him into the faith. And he said, "I hope to attract the hearts of the kings and rulers of all the countries to this wonderful cause of God." Wasn't he a wonderful person for the Bab to teach? Just a tremendous story. And the Bab was very touched and deeply moved by this. And he said, "Your desire is more important to me than the act itself. But your days and mine are numbered. And there is too short a time left for you to achieve your hopes." The Bab said that the faith would be spread not by big and noble and wealthy people, but by poor and persecuted people who loved God. But he promised Manucher Khan that God would shower blessings on him in the world to come because of his love and kindness. And then he said he had only 3 months and 9 days left in this world. And of course, that's exactly what happened. 3 months and 9 days, Manu Cher Khan died, and his nephew, who was not a friend of the Bab at all, became governor in his place. He's a wicked person. And the moment the new governor discovered the Bab was still in the city, he wrote to the Shah, who ordered that the Bab be sent to him at once. And the journey was made on horseback and took many days. Muhammad Beg was the commander of the soldiers who were sent with the Bab. And as always happened wherever the Bab went, soon Muhammad Beg and the other guards learned to love their prisoner so much that if the Bab had wished to escape, they would have let him go gladly. Of course, the Bab wouldn't let them do that or get into trouble because of him. No one could ever be kinder than the Bab. And it was a wonderful trip because the Bab loved the country. And he was very happy when one evening they camped on a beautiful hill, orchards and meadows on all sides. A tent was pitched for him so that he might be comfortable. And while he was there, the Bab received from Baha'u'llah, listen to this, while he was there, the Bab received from Baha'u'llah a letter and gifts, which made him so happy that everyone wondered as they looked at his radiant face. Baha'u'llah, you remember, was the second divine teacher whom God was to send. But as yet, he had not revealed himself to the people. One night, while they were camped on a hill, it was suddenly discovered that the Bab's tent was empty. No one knew where the Bab was. At first, some of the guards were frightened, thinking the Bab had run away. But Muhammad Beg spoke softly to them and said, "No doubt the Bab has retired in silence of this moonlit night to a place where he can seek undisturbed communion with God. The Bab will unquestionably return to his tent. He will never desert us. Believe it." And sure enough, a few minutes later, they saw the Bab coming alone from the direction of Tehran. "Did you believe me to have escaped?" the Bab asked. His face looked so radiant and beautiful and happy that Muhammad Beg threw himself at his feet. "Far be it from me ever to entertain such thoughts," he cried. For 2 weeks they stayed in that lovely spot. They were awaiting word from Tehran, where the Bab had sent a letter to the king, asking that he meet with the king and all the religious leaders, and that he would prove the truth of his faith before them, and if he didn't, he would sacrifice his life. And the king was torn by that. He wanted to see that promised one who had captured the heart of Manu Cher, the castle of Maku in the north. And there he was to stay until the Shah sent for him again. Of course, the Bab knew that his enemies had asked the king to do this. They believed that if the Bab should be taken to that far-off, lonely spot, his friends wouldn't be able to reach him there. And they hoped that the people would forget all about him, everything they'd heard about the coming of a new teacher. Of course, they didn't understand that God does whatsoever he willeth, and that no one can stop his message from reaching the people, as you will hear. When the time came for the Bab to say goodbye to the soldiers, Muhammad Beg, with tears in his eyes, begged the Bab's forgiveness because he had not done enough for him. But the Bab told the soldier that he would always remember Muhammad Beg for his kindness, and that all who heard about him in the future would bless him when they remembered his name, Muhammad Beg. Isn't that lovely? And the other soldiers kissed the Bab's feet, and with tears in their eyes, they asked the Bab to bless them too. And the Bab thanked each one of them warmly for their great kindness to him. And the escort led the Bab north to a prison, a cell in the far-off mountains to the north. They thought they'd be rid of him once and for all, but there he, the Bab, gave to the world a book that heralded the world order of Baha'u'llah, that was to change the face of society and usher in the Christ-promised kingdom of God on earth. Can you imagine such a thing? Well, you just have to wait until later to hear the rest of that wonderful story. The time has come now for our visit to the castle of Maku. This is chapter 17. Remember last time we heard how the Shah had ordered that the Bab be shut up in the castle of Maku. The Shah and the others near him thought that by doing this, the people would forget about the Bab and his message. But now we'll see just how mistaken they were. On the way to Maku, the Bab passed through the city of Tabriz, where later he was to be martyred. That's a wonderful story we'll hear a little later on. But the first time he entered the city of Tabriz, an immense crowd of people thronged the gate of the city to await his entry. And as he walked along the streets, cries of welcome and love rang out, and a great many shouted, "God is most great," when they saw him, and they cheered the Bab on his way. And the same detachment of soldiers who guarded and protected him on this occasion would at a later date in that same city be chosen to fire the volley that would take his life. When the Bab's friends wondered at what was going to happen to him, the Bab told them that for no less than 9 months he would be imprisoned in the north in Maku, and from there he would be transferred to another prison. And 5 days later that journey began. The Bab was delivered into the custody of the warden of the prison of Maku. Of course, the people of Tabriz were saddened as they watched the Bab depart out of their city. And many of them were confused by the Bab's apparent helplessness. And they turned away and didn't believe anymore, just as the people had turned away from Christ in his time and believed no more. They whispered, as the people had whispered in Jerusalem when Christ was turned over to Pontius Pilate. They said, "If this is the promised one, why is he being subjected to the whim of the men of earth? Where is his power? Why doesn't he come down from the cross? Why doesn't the Bab free himself?" But as we know, that's not the way that it works. The Bab had wonderful things to do that could only be done in the castle of Maku, high up in the mountains, in a very lonely part of the country. At the foot of the mountain was a small town. The people who lived there were rough and quarrelsome, and there was only one road from the castle, and this road led through the town to a gate, which was always closed and guarded. Ali Khan was the warden. He had charge of the castle. Ali Khan was a soldier who was very stern and unfriendly to the Bab, and the 2 friends who were allowed to live with the Bab. No other friends were allowed, even in the town. The Bab said he had 2 companions and 4 dogs. That's all the company that was with him there in the side of the mountain in the beginning. The Bab was so kind and gentle, however, that it began to happen all over again. And it wasn't long before these rough people began to love the Bab too, just as all the other people had done when they met him. Early in the morning, many of them would come to the foot of the mountain, where they could look up at his window, and they hoped they might see the Bab for only a moment. And then the Bab would bless their work for the day. That's a beautiful picture, isn't it? But Ali Khan still remained very unfriendly, and he wouldn't let any of the Bab's friends come to visit him. But one day, a strange thing happened, something which shows how very wonderful the Bab was. The Bab and the 2 companions who were with him in the castle heard a knock at the door, and opening it, they saw the warden, Ali Khan, waiting to come in. But this was a very different Ali Khan. Before, he had been very proud and cruel-looking, and now he seemed much gentler, and there was a look of surprise on his face. He even trembled as he stepped into the room in which the Bab sat. And the next moment, to the great astonishment of the 2 friends, the warden Ali Khan threw himself at the Bab's feet. Well, they could hardly believe their eyes. "Is this the same man?" they said. Ali Khan looked at the Bab and he said, "Deliver me from my perplexity." And then he told the Bab and his companions about the strange thing that had happened to him, something he just couldn't understand. This is what had happened. That morning at dawn, the warden was riding through the countryside outside of town. It was so early that no one was about yet, except one man who was standing beside the river praying. Ali Khan went closer, and to his astonishment, he saw that that man was the Bab. Imagine. Well, Ali Khan started toward the Bab to rebuke him for leaving the castle. But the Bab was so deep in his prayer by the river that he didn't hear him at all. Instead, Ali Khan decided he would leave the Bab there for the time, and he'd hurry back to the castle, and he'd punish those guards who had allowed the Bab to leave without his permission. But when he arrived at the town, he was surprised to find the gate still locked. Also the door of the castle was closed and locked, just as he had left it. And when the door was opened, there was the Bab inside, in prison, seated before him. Well, you can imagine how astonished Ali Khan was, because he had just left the Bab down the mountainside beside the river. Well, he said to the Bab, "I am utterly confounded. I don't know whether my reason has deserted me." Of course, by this, Ali Khan meant that he was afraid he was losing his mind. How could the Bab be down by the river and up in the cell, too? "What you have witnessed was true," the Bab answered. And then the Bab went on to explain that God wished Ali Khan to know that the Bab's message was the truth. God wanted him to see how wonderful it was, and to love this teacher whom God had sent. And from that day on, Ali Khan was so changed that the people of the town hardly knew him. Instead of being arrogant and cruel and proud, Ali Khan was kind and gentle. That's the way God changes the hearts of people. That's why the messengers come, you know. Well, the gate of the castle was still closed at night, but during the day Ali Khan left it open, and everyone who wished to see the Bab was allowed to enter freely. Every day Ali Khan himself brought the Bab fresh fruit or something he might like to eat. While the Bab was a prisoner in the castle, he wrote a book called the Persian Bayan, and in it he laid down the laws which the people were to obey. And in it he told about the other divine teacher whom God was to send, and urged everyone to find him. And you know what else? He even called him by name, Baha'u'llah, in that book. When we read this true story about the Bab, it makes us know how God brings good out of everything, even though it may not seem good at first, if we're patient. The Shah, the king, thought that when he sent the Bab to Maku, he was sending him where he would not be able to talk or see anyone. But instead of that, all of the people who lived in the mountains around the castle heard his message and became his friends. And he wrote this very great book that we were talking about, which became the law for his day. As a matter of fact, during his 9 months in that prison of Maku, the Bab's pen poured out more than 100,000 verses. Can you imagine such a thing? And the Bab wrote this great book saying that his mission was twofold. 1, to call men back to God, and 2, to announce the coming of one who would soon appear. And the Bab said that this figure would be so exalted and so wonderful that it would be better to read just one verse from his pen than to recite the whole of his own book, a big book, 1,000 times. And that's wonderful, isn't it? When you think of how marvelous the Bab is, then imagine who Baha'u'llah must be. For the Bab said he was like a ring upon Baha'u'llah's finger. I think it's very interesting to hear what the Bab said, too, there. You know, Christ told his disciples about the last day and said, "Watch, therefore, for you know not what hour your Lord cometh." And the Bab said almost the same thing. He said, "Be awake on the day of the appearance of the promised one." And they both meant Baha'u'llah, of course. Well, the Bab prayed constantly for the coming of this great world shepherd, Baha'u'llah, asking God to hurry the day, because he, the Bab, was ready to give his life for it. Honestly, that's not all in the book, but I just got so excited about it. This is chapter 18, Ali Khan's dream, about the warden again. Remember the vision he had of the Bab down by the river? He had another dream that was absolutely fascinating. It happened one day while the Bab was still a prisoner in the castle of Maku. Who do you think came to visit him? Our old friend Mullah Husayn. And how very happy Mullah Husayn was to be with the Bab again, to know that soon he would see the Bab once more, because he loved him very much. Remember, he was the very first one to hear the message of the Bab and that the promised one has come. 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset, evening of May 22nd, 1844. Well, here is Mullah Husayn now on his way to the prison. So we know the visit meant a great deal to him. He walked all the way. He said he wouldn't ride one step of the way, even though it was a long, hard journey. On foot, he would go to see his beloved one. And Mullah Husayn and his friends wanted to give him many things to make the journey easier, because it was a long ways. But he wouldn't take anything, not a thing, So this is the story of how Mullah Husayn came to the castle of Maku. The night before Mullah Husayn arrived was the eve of the new year. And on that night, Ali Khan, you remember he was in charge of the castle, had a dream. In his dream, he heard that Muhammad was to visit the Bab on New Year's Day. And feeling very much excited, Ali Khan ran out to meet him in his dream. He walked toward the river, and as he reached the bridge, he saw two men coming toward him. One was walking before the other. Well, he thought the first one was Muhammad, and running forward, he was about to throw himself at his feet when he woke up. He was feeling happier than he'd ever felt in his life. His whole body seemed to be filled with joy. And Ali Khan said it was like he was in heaven. So real did that dream seem. He was sure, because of his other experience with the Bab, that this was more than a dream. So that morning, he said his morning prayers, and he put on his richest clothes, and he started out for the spot where in his dream he had seen Muhammad come. He was sure that somebody would be there. He ordered his servants to saddle 3 of his best and swiftest horses and take them at once to the bridge, so Muhammad, his companion, and himself could ride back in glory to the prison. Well, it was very early in the morning, and the sun had just come up over the horizon when Ali Khan walked alone toward the river. And what do you think? Right there at the bridge, just as he had dreamed it, he saw 2 men coming, walking, one before the other. Ali Khan was overcome. He fell at the feet of the one who was in front, whom he thought was Muhammad, and he begged him and his companion please to accept his horses and ride the rest of the way of their journey. No, the first one said, I have vowed to accomplish the whole of my journey on foot. I will walk to the summit of this mountain, and there I will visit your prisoner. Of course, the visitor wasn't Muhammad, as you know, or as Ali Khan had dreamed. It was Mullah Husayn. Ali Khan followed Mullah Husayn until they reached the gate of the castle, and there the Bab stood waiting. And at the sight of him, Mullah Husayn stopped, and he bowed low, but the Bab took him in his arms. We can imagine what a wonderful moment that was. Then, taking Mullah Husayn by the hand, he led him into the castle, where the Bab and Mullah Husayn celebrated together the Feast of Nowruz, or the New Year. What a New Year's festival that must have been. You know, until that time, none of the Bab's friends, except the 2 who lived with him, had been allowed to spend the night in the castle. But that day, Ali Khan went to the Bab and he said, If it be your desire to retain Mullah Husayn with you this night, I am ready to abide by your wish, for I have no will of my own. However long you desire to have Mullah Husayn stay with you, I pledge myself to carry out your command. Well, that shows, doesn't it, how much the warden, Ali Khan, had changed. And another wonderful story I remember, because I stood there on the side of that mountain. I went up to that cell. I looked out over the valley, and I saw the river and all those beautiful spots. And I remembered how one day the Bab and Mullah Husayn, they stood together on the roof of this prison, and they looked out over that same valley, and down at the river below, they saw the river Aras, also called the Araxes. And the Bab told Mullah Husayn that this was the same river spoken of by the poet Hafez so long ago. And Hafez had said in his poem that the breeze that blew there should bend down and kiss the banks to make its breath fragrant. So beautiful was this spot. Of course, because the blessed Bab was there. The Bab said that God put in the tongues of poets all these treasures that they wrote years and years before, and they didn't even know the wonder of what they were writing. The Bab told Mullah Husayn that if his stay had not been so short, he would have shown him the other spot spoken of by the poet. Hail to thee 1,000 times hail, the poet said, about the next place where the Bab was to go and be a prisoner. You know, that's one way we know about messengers of God, because they fulfill all of these wonderful promises. But those are lovely, aren't they? And just listen to this. Just listen how marvelous this is. The Bab told Mullah Husayn on that same day about the remarkable prophecy mentioned about both Shiraz and Baghdad. This is fantastic. You know that the Bab made his declaration in the city of Shiraz, of course, and that Baha'u'llah made his declaration in Baghdad. Now, just listen. Just think. The Bab turned to Mullah Husayn and he said, "The following verse is also divinely inspired. Shiraz will be thrown into a tumult. A youth of sugar tongue will appear. And I fear that the breath of his mouth should agitate and upset Baghdad." That's exactly what happened. And as I stood there that day, I remembered that verse. I looked out over where the eyes of the Bab and Mullah Husayn had looked, and my eyes filled with tears that I was so lucky and so to be able to be a part of this wonderful faith. I think we should all stand up and just congratulate each other that we're Baha'is. Well, that's what happened, part of what happened in Maku. The Bab said to Mullah Husayn finally, "A few days after your departure from this place, they will transfer us to another mountain. And ere you arrive at your destination, the news of our departure from Maku will have reached you." And it happened exactly as the Bab had said. And for the last time, they were separated. The Bab to go to his prison, and later to his martyrdom, and Mullah Husayn to famous Sheikh Tabarsi, where he would be such a hero. The Bab was sent to another castle because the warden Ali Khan and all the people had become so friendly with him, and so many of his friends had found him and thronged there in great numbers, that they decided to send him further away yet. And at one of the places where Mullah Husayn stopped, they gave him the news that the Bab had been transferred to another prison. As for Mullah Husayn, he walked all the way back home, just as he had walked to the castle of Maku. This is chapter 19. How many girls do we have listening to us, this story today? Would you raise your hands, please? Oh, good. A lot of lovely young ladies. Small, but very sweet. Well, you're going to love this story, because it's not about a man at all. It's about a woman, a very young and beautiful woman, when she first heard and accepted the Bab as the promised one. This is one of the most wonderful stories of all, because this woman, Tahereh, the pure, was one of the famous letters of the living. So I've taken a little more time with this story, because we've heard about a great many men who heard the message of the Bab and set out to tell others about it. Now we're going to hear about a wonderful woman who also traveled all over the country giving his message. Her name was Tahereh, and she was very beautiful and very good. And she wrote beautiful poems. Perhaps someday you will read some of them. Well, at that time, the women of Persia didn't go about freely among the people as the men did. When it was necessary for them to go out on the street, they wore veils over their faces so they couldn't be seen. Tahereh also wore such a veil for many years. After a while, however, she didn't feel that it was necessary or right for women to do this, and she was the very first one to go out of her home without one. And later, you will hear about how she first appeared without her veil. Tahereh was one of the letters of the living, one of the important disciples of the Bab. You remember about them. They were the 18 disciples or followers of the Bab that we've been talking about. Mullah Husayn, Qudus, all the others. And all were men except Tahereh. And just think, she didn't even have to see the Bab to believe in him. As soon as she heard the message from someone else, she knew that was the truth, immediately. And at once she sent a letter to the Bab. In this letter, she told him how happy she was to receive the wonderful message, and she knew it was true and that he was the promised one. And the Bab answered this letter and named Tahereh one of the letters of the living. Here's how it happened. When she was younger, she wanted to study with Siyyid Kazim because she knew that there was talk about a promised one. And she told her uncle, imagine, that she wanted to be the very first woman on earth to serve the promised one when he came. Isn't that beautiful? She had a dream, too. And in her dream, a beautiful youth was writing down lovely verses and speaking them. And she awoke out of her dream, and she sat down, and she wrote down one of those beautiful verses, word for word. And when later someone gave her some of the writings of the Bab, she looked at the page, and what do you think? Right there was that very verse of the Bab that she'd heard in her dream. That's when she wrote to him and said she believed in him with all her heart. Well, she went to Karbala to see Siyyid Kazim, but when she got there, he was dead. But Mullah Husayn was there, and he was just leaving on his search for the Bab. So Tahereh began to teach, and she was so excellent at it that they were alarmed, and so they put her under house arrest. But eventually she left. She went to Kermanshah, and there she translated and read publicly before all the people one of the writings of the Bab. And the governor himself and all of his family became followers of the faith. She went to Kairan and had such a welcome that she taught 3 days there, and 1,200 new believers came into the faith because she really set their hearts on fire. Isn't that a tremendous story? Well, from this time on, Tahereh spent all of her time telling everyone who would listen about the Bab. Of course, it wasn't very long before the people who didn't like the Bab began to try to harm Tahereh too. They wanted to keep her from talking. She was so eloquent and beautiful. And at last they made Tahereh a prisoner in the home of one of them, and they wouldn't let her see anybody at all. Tahereh knew that they wanted to kill her, really, and had plans to do so, just as they had the other disciples of the Bab. But Tahereh was afraid of no one, because she knew that God would take care of her. Actually, she told those who kept her prisoner that she would prove that the message she was giving was really from God. Tahereh told them that if her message was true, God would free her in 9 days from the house in which she was locked up and guarded. Well, of course, they didn't believe that. I mean, they didn't think it would be possible for such a thing to happen, and they were making the guard and the imprisonment even more strict. But we're going to see exactly what happened, because we know, don't we, what God can do. Well, at this very time, Baha'u'llah decided that Tahereh should be allowed to go free, and he determined to show the people that her message was truly from God. So Baha'u'llah sent for one of his friends and told him that he was to take Tahereh to his own home, Baha'u'llah's house, in the city of Tehran. Now, here's how that was done. It would surprise the people. It's a lovely story. The wife of the man who was to take Tahereh to Tehran disguised herself as a beggar so that no one would know her. And then she went to the house where Tahereh was kept prisoner and gave her a letter from Baha'u'llah. This letter told Tahereh exactly what to do, and the woman waited at the door of the house until Tahereh joined her, both of them in disguise, and they hurried back to her husband, of course. Tahereh was disguised too, and so that no one would see her. My God, it's just like a fairy tale, isn't it? Huh? Beautiful princess locked up and rescued at the last minute by a beggar in disguise. Isn't that exciting? And in those days, there were high walls around the city. It was very hard to get in or get out, and the enemies could be kept out that way, and also people inside, prisoners, could be kept out, could be kept in and couldn't get away. Well, according to Baha'u'llah's instructions, a man had brought 3 horses and left them in a safe place outside the walls of the city. And when they escaped, he, Tahereh, they were out, and that's the home of Baha'u'llah. In the meantime, when it was discovered that Tahereh had escaped, everyone was filled with wonder. Even her friends couldn't imagine where she had gone, how she had got away. The whole night long they searched the houses all around, every room, but, of course, they couldn't find her. She vanished just like that. And then they remembered what Tahereh had told them, that if her message about the Bab was true, God would free her from prison within 9 days. And now she was gone, and the 9 days were not yet up. And many believed the message and became followers of the Bab because of what had happened. In all this time, Tahereh was happy, very happy, in the home of His Holiness Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah had not yet announced that he was the second divine teacher whom God was sending. But Tahereh was so good, and her heart was so pure, and she was so close to God, that she knew Baha'u'llah's secret. And you can imagine how happy it made her to live in his house. And let me just tell you something else about Tahereh. She was called the Pure One. Baha'u'llah called her that. And at the conference of Badash, she threw off the veil for the first time. And she said, I am the bugle, I am the bell. It was the beginning of women's rights, and she was the first woman suffragette martyr. And people wrote about her and said she was a miracle of science and a miracle of beauty. And one day in the mayor's house at a wedding feast, while the music and dancing was going on, she began to talk about the Bab. She was so beautiful and so eloquent. All the people at the feast came to listen to her and went away from the musicians and the dancing. Can you imagine that? No wonder that we're so proud of her and love her so much. You can see this is a story for grown-ups, too. But you can feel the greatness. You tell your parents about Tahereh. Lord Curzon said that heroism of Tahereh was one of the most moving episodes in all of modern history. And a Turkish poet wrote and said, "Oh, Tahereh, you were worth 1,000 kings." Another said she was a wonder among women. And Edward Granville Brown, who saw Baha'u'llah, said, if there was no other claim to the truth of the Bab's faith, Tahereh would have been enough. And the most famous actress, Sarah Bernhardt, asked that they make a play about Tahereh so she could be in the play. And the poet called Tahereh the man who wrote it. The playwright said she was the Persian Joan of Arc. And you know something? Even the king was moved. He said that if Tahereh would deny the Bab, he would put her in charge of all of the women of his household and marry her, and she could become his bride. But Tahereh replied and said, "For you is the kingdom and the crown, but for me, wandering and teaching the word of God." And the king said that so far, history has not shown us such a woman as Tahereh. Well, that's the story for you young ladies about Tahereh. She was also known as Kuratalain, consolation of the eyes, and others called her Zarin Taj, one crowned with gold. But in our hearts, this beautiful, courageous heroine will always live by the name Baha'u'llah gave her, Tahereh, the pure one. This is chapter 20, and it's called The New Order. All this time, the Bab and Baha'u'llah and their followers had been obeying the laws which had been set down in the Quran. You see, when one of God's divine teachers comes to us, he leaves directions and laws in a book for us. Muhammad had left such directions in the Quran. Well, after many years, however, some of the laws in these books have to be changed, because people have grown wiser and times are different, and the laws no longer apply. So then God sends a new teacher, a new messenger, who brings new laws and leaves new directions for that particular day. You know, just like the sunshine which came up today, that was the same sun that was here yesterday. Well, there's no use to count on the sun of yesterday. That's gone. We have to have a new sunshine today to make things grow and to develop. Well, that's the way it is with religion. After many of these years, times change. Now, in the days we've been hearing about, the time had come for some of the laws to be changed. The others no longer applied and weren't needed. And this story tells about the way one of them was changed. You remember Tahereh. Well, I'll bet you'll never forget Tahereh. She had been living in the house of His Holiness Baha'u'llah in Tehran. After a time, however, Baha'u'llah decided to send her to another city. Of course, this wasn't easy to do because the gates of the city were guarded all of the time, and women were not allowed to leave without a letter or a permit. Strange to say, however, the guards did not stop Tahereh and those who were with her. They didn't even ask where they were going. They just went through the gate. That shows you that what Baha'u'llah wanted to do, he was able to do no matter what other people wanted. And a few days later, Baha'u'llah himself left the city, and he traveled in the same direction. And not long afterward, they were met by Qudus, who had come to welcome His Holiness Baha'u'llah. They all arrived in the same place, and all the people of that neighborhood were very excited over the presence of Baha'u'llah and Qudus. Some were so glad that they were ready to do anything they wanted. Of course, there were some enemies there, too, who were filled with hate and wished to do them harm. That's the way it is. Always is like that with the coming of one of God's teachers. People either love them very, very dearly, or they fear them and wish them harm because they don't want things changed. They want to stay the way they are. You see, it depends on what is in each person's heart. If the hearts are kind and good, they love these teachers. If the hearts are wicked, they don't want to hear a word about it whatsoever. Well, this was around the beginning of summer, and His Holiness Baha'u'llah rented 3 gardens, one for Tahereh, one for Qudus, and one for himself. And when the friends knew about this, many came to be near them, and finally 81 followers of the Bab had gathered there, and they were all the guests of Baha'u'llah. This all took place at a very famous hamlet called B&aacute. Remember that name, B&aacute. That's going to be a famous name in history for thousands of years. Well, one day, while the friends were all sitting together, a messenger came from Tahereh. The message said that she would like to have Qudus come to her. And since Qudus didn't wish to leave Baha'u'llah, he refused her invitation. And again the message came, another messenger with the same message. She insists on your visit, the messenger said. If you persist in your refusal, she herself will come to you. Qudus was about to say no again, when at that moment Tahereh herself walked in, and to the great astonishment of everyone, she was not wearing a veil. That was the first time that they'd ever seen her without her veil. And we can imagine how shocked they were to see her, for women always wore veils when they were away from their homes. Some thought that Tahereh was very wicked and would have rushed out if His Holiness Baha'u'llah had not stopped them. But he spoke quietly to them and bade them to be calm and to be happy. And Baha'u'llah's words quieted them. But Tahereh was so sure she was doing the right thing that her face shone with joy. One story tells us that she cried out, "I am the blast of the trumpet. I am the call of the bugle. I would awaken sleeping souls." You remember we mentioned something about that last time. By this, Tahereh meant that the time had come for the old laws about women to be changed. As she spoke to them, her words were so like those in the Quran that all were surprised and interested. And it was then that His Holiness Baha'u'llah gave her the name Tahereh, the Pure One. And from then on, the women of the East began to be more free in many ways. And how grateful they must have been to this beautiful woman. And from that day on, the life and habits of the followers of the Bab were changed in many ways. They knew that the old order, or the old way of doing things, had gone, and the new order, or the new day, had come. And when they went on to another city, Qudus and Tahereh traveled together in the same howdah, or carriage. You know, I had the bounty of seeing with my own eyes those 3 gardens that Baha'u'llah picked. One that was for him, one for Qudus, and one for Tahereh, when they were at B&aacute. That's a beautiful place, you know. Like an oasis in the desert, and there's a beautiful stream flowing around the big garden where all the friends gathered together, going down past the caravanserai where all those 81 followers of the Bab had stayed. That caravanserai is mostly in ruins now, but there's enough there left yet to see how lovely it was, and the whole place is very beautiful and very fragrant. And as I stood there, I could almost hear the voices of those heroes of God, and I could almost hear Tahereh say, "I am the bugle, I am the bell." It was very exciting for me. And did you know that when Baha'u'llah was there, at the conference of B&aacute, as they called it, that he revealed a special letter, a tablet, each day of the 22 days that the friends were there at that conference. And he gave to everyone present a new name, because it was a new day. And you know the most wonderful thing, later, when the Bab wrote to each one of them, he called them by the new name which Baha'u'llah had given to them. Isn't that exciting how close the Bab and Baha'u'llah were together? And when one of the men complained about Tahereh casting aside her veil, when he complained to the Bab replied and said, "What am I to say regarding her whom the tongue of power and glory," meaning Baha'u'llah, "whom the tongue of power and glory has named Tahereh, the Pure One?" And you know how young people like to sing? Well, on the journey home from that marvelous conference, Tahereh herself composed an ode or a poem for each day, which they all chanted and sang. And they say that the mountains and the valleys of that part of the world echoed with the musics and with their shouts of joy as they journeyed along, hailing the birth of a new day. What a woman. Isn't that one of the most wonderful stories you ever heard? Are you ready? Good. This is chapter 21, and it's called Muhammad Ali's Vision, and it's about a very young boy. Do you remember the story that told how the Bab was made a prisoner in the castle of Maku? Yeah, I knew you would. And how after another time he was sent still to another prison? But no matter where he went,